Hello, curious minds. Welcome to this intellectual journey. Today, we're going to explore a habit you probably consider completely normal, but which, in the past, was seen as something extraordinary, almost like a form of magic or a superpower reserved for a select few. Ready to uncover its secrets? Imagine for a moment a world where reading privately, inside your head, without moving your lips, was so unusual that people would stop and stare in amazement. A world where the silent thought you're having right now, reading this, was an anomaly. Sounds incredible, but that world was our reality for thousands of years. The big question we're going to unravel is simple yet profound. How did we go from a world where literature was a public spectacle, a loud performance, to the intimate and silent experience we know today? The answer changed not only how we read, but also how we think and feel. Before we dive in, I wanted to tell you a bit about the images you're seeing. To bring this narrative to life, I've used artificial intelligence tools to generate them. So, think of them as a canvas, a way to illustrate the ideas and atmosphere of what I'm telling you. They won't always be an exact or literal representation, but rather a visual accompaniment to help your imagination soar with me. I sincerely hope you enjoy it. To understand this shift, we first need to travel back to antiquity, to places like Greece and Rome. There, reading was fundamentally an oral activity. Texts were read aloud, whether to a group of people in a public square or even when someone was completely alone in their room. The main reason for this custom wasn't just cultural, but also practical. Most ancient texts were written in what's known as scriptio continua. This literally means continuous writing, a sea of letters with no spaces between words, no punctuation marks like commas or periods, and often no distinction between upper and lower case. Try reading a page like that silently, and you'll see how difficult it is. The brain has to make an enormous effort to decipher where one word ends and the next begins. Reading aloud helped solve this puzzle. By vocalizing the sounds, the reader could find the rhythm and cadence of the language, grouping letters into understandable words. Therefore, in antiquity, reading wasn't just decoding text, it was interpreting and performing it. A good reader was also a good orator, someone who could bring the words of a poem or a philosophical treatise to life. Literature wasn't consumed privately, it was experienced communally, like going to the theater or a concert. This meant that the relationship with books was very different. Texts weren't objects for personal, silent reflection, but rather scripts for a performance. Meaning was constructed in the act of declamation, in the intonation, in the pauses, and in the reaction of the listening audience. In fact, the idea of silent reading was so alien that when someone was caught doing it, it often generated suspicion or immense admiration. It was a mental feat that defied the conventions of the time, considered an act of unusual concentration and intellectual power. There are fascinating anecdotes about great historical figures. It's said that Alexander the Great could read letters from his mother silently amidst his generals, an act that demonstrated his incredible capacity for abstraction and self-control, detaching his mind from the noisy public environment. Another famous example is Julius Caesar, who, it is reported, could read and dictate letters to his scribes simultaneously. This ability to process text internally while performing another verbal task was a clear sign that his mind didn't rely on vocalization to comprehend what was written. But perhaps the clearest and most transformative testimony about this change comes from the 4th century AD. It was documented by one of history's most brilliant minds, St. Augustine, in his famous book, Confessions. What he observed would forever change the history of thought. Augustine describes with utter astonishment how he watched his mentor, Bishop Ambrose of Milan, reading. And here's the striking part. He writes, and I quote with amazement, "When he read, his eyes glided over the pages and his heart sought out the sense, but his voice and his tongue were silent." For Augustine, this was a baffling spectacle. He wondered why Ambrose would do such a thing. Was he perhaps afraid that a curious listener might ask him difficult questions about the text if they heard him? Or was he simply saving his voice for when he had to preach? He couldn't quite understand it. What Augustine was witnessing was a silent revolution. He was seeing a man have a private and direct conversation with the author of the text across centuries without the need for an oral intermediary. He was seeing the birth of reading as an act of personal introspection. This change, though seemingly small, is monumental. Silent reading allows for a much faster rate of information processing. The eye can move quicker than the tongue, enabling us to absorb ideas at a pace that oral reading simply cannot match. It's the difference between walking and flying. But the most profound effect occurred within the brain. By not having to externalize words, a new space was created, an inner, private, and silent space where the text's ideas could mingle with the reader's own thoughts, generating reflection, critique, and new connections. Silent reading is in many ways the cradle of the modern self. It fostered the idea of a rich, private inner life, a dialogue with oneself that isn't shared with the outside world. Before this, thought was much more closely tied to the spoken word and community. Think about it for a moment. The ability to read a heretical or revolutionary idea in complete secrecy, without anyone knowing what's going through your mind, is an incredibly powerful tool. It allows for dissent, doubt, and independent thought in a way that public reading cannot. Now, this change didn't happen overnight. Ambrose's practice was the exception, not the rule. During the Middle Ages, reading aloud continued to be the dominant way to interact with texts, especially in monasteries, where reading was a vocal meditation. Monks practiced lectio divina, a slow, repetitive reading of scriptures in a low voice or murmur. The goal was to memorize and assimilate the text, not just with the mind, but with the entire body, through the sound and vibration of one's own voice. It was a total experience. However, little by little, the conditions for silent reading began to improve. Irish and Anglo-Saxon scribes around the 7th and 8th centuries started to introduce a crucial innovation, something we now take for granted. They began to put spaces between words. This simple visual change enormously reduced the cognitive load required for reading. It was no longer a puzzle that had to be solved audibly. The eye could now identify units of meaning, i.e., words, quickly and efficiently, facilitating purely visual reading. Later, with the appearance of the first universities in the 12th century, the demand for books grew exponentially. Students and scholars needed to consult many different sources quickly. Reading aloud was too slow for this new academic pace. Silent reading became an essential tool for research and study. It allowed a scholar to scan a text for specific information, compare passages from different books, and construct complex arguments in the privacy of their mind before committing them to writing. But the true turning point, the event that popularized silent reading and made it the norm, was the invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg in the mid-15th century. This was the game-changing catalyst that completely democratized access to books. The printing press made books cheaper, more accessible, and above all, more standardized. Clear typography, consistent punctuation, and spaces between words became the norm. Texts were designed to be read with the eyes, not with the ears. It was a revolution in design. With the explosion of available books, a new class of reader emerged. It wasn't just monks or university scholars anymore. The bourgeoisie, merchants, and eventually common people began to read for pleasure, for information, and for personal edification, most often in the privacy of their homes. This new silent reader developed an intimate and personal relationship with literature. The book became a portal to other worlds, a silent confidant, a private teacher. The experience of getting lost in a novel, losing track of time and space, was born in this era. So, as we see, silent reading is not an innate human ability. It's a cultural invention, a mental technology we developed over many centuries. It's a superpower that required changes both in how we wrote and how our brains processed language. Let's look at why this is so relevant today. We live in an age of information overload. We constantly read on our phones, tablets, and computers. The ability to process text quickly and silently, which so astonished St. Augustine, is now the foundation of our knowledge society. Every time you read an email, a news article, or a text message, you're using this mental technology, refined throughout history. You're participating in a silent conversation, absorbing ideas, and connecting with other minds without uttering a single sound. However, this evolution has also come at a cost. The communal and auditory dimension of literature has taken a back seat. We've gained privacy and speed, but perhaps we've lost something of the shared experience, the magic of listening to a well-told story in a group. Audiobooks and podcasts, so popular today, can be seen as a return to that ancient oral tradition, a rediscovery of the pleasure of being read to, of closing our eyes and letting another person's voice build worlds in our imagination. It's a cycle returning to its origins. The next time you pick up a book and immerse yourself in its pages in complete silence, pause for a second. Think about the incredible historical journey that made that moment possible. It's not a trivial act. It's the culmination of one of the most important revolutions in human cognition. You're using a superpower that connects you directly with the minds of people who lived centuries ago. You're exercising a form of freedom of thought that was, at one time, a rarity. You're creating a private universe within your own mind, something an ancient Roman would have considered pure sorcery. In summary, reading wasn't always as we know it. It transitioned from a public, audible, and communal act limited by difficult-to-decipher texts to a private, silent, and rapid experience. This change was made possible by innovations like spaces between words and the printing press. This transformation didn't just change literature. It changed science, philosophy, religion, and politics. It allowed for deep reflection, secret critique, and the rapid dissemination of new ideas. Ultimately, the superpower of silent reading helped shape the modern world as we know it. So, the story of silent reading is the story of the invention of mental privacy. It's a reminder that the tools we use to think, even those that seem most natural, have a history and have actively molded who we are and what we've become. Reading in antiquity was, in essence, an act of memory and performance. Great orators didn't just read, they interpreted the text for an audience that, for the most part, couldn't read. The book was a script for the social event, not an object for individual consumption. Consider education. A Roman student didn't sit down to read in silence. They listened to the teacher read and comment on the texts. Learning was a constant dialogue, an oral transmission of knowledge where the sound of words was fundamental for comprehension and memorization. The lack of punctuation also forced a slower, more deliberate reading. The reader had to feel the sentence structure through their own vocalization. Each reading was, in a way, a new edition of the text, as the reader decided the pauses and emphasis, interpreting the author's intention. When silent reading began to spread, some thinkers of the time even viewed it with suspicion. They feared that the social dimension of knowledge would be lost, and that people would become isolated in their own worlds of ideas, without the benefit of communal debate and correction. Ambrose's act, therefore, wasn't just efficient, it was subversive. He claimed interpretive authority for the individual. He no longer needed audience validation to understand the text. Meaning was created in the silent chamber of his own consciousness, a radically private act. This cognitive development can be compared to learning a new language. The brain had to create new neural pathways to directly connect the visual center with the language processing centers, bypassing the detour of sound production and hearing. This new cerebral fast lane is what allows for speed reading or skimming, the ability to glance over a text to grasp the general idea. A skill unthinkable in a world of scriptio continua, but absolutely essential in our information age. Silence became the canvas of thought. Silent reading allows questions, doubts, and objections to arise in real time as you read. You can stop, reread a sentence, and debate with the author in your head without interrupting an external flow. The book, thanks to silent reading, transformed from a communal object into a personal possession, an extension of the individual's memory and identity. Personal libraries, once an extreme luxury, became a reflection of their owner's soul and mind. The novel as a literary genre, which explores the deep psychology and inner life of characters, is a direct child of silent reading. It requires a reader who can empathize and live within another's mind, a feat greatly facilitated by private reading. Even our conception of authorship changed. In an oral world, stories were modified with each retelling. With the printing press and silent reading, the text became fixed. The author became a unique authority, and their work a stable artifact that could be precisely studied and analyzed. Consider modern science. The scientific revolution was driven by scholars who could read the works of others in private, verify data, and build upon them incrementally. Silent rapid reading was the invisible engine of that progress. The Protestant Reformation, for example, depended on the idea that individuals could read and interpret the Bible for themselves without the mediation of a priest. This principle is fundamentally based on the existence of a competent, private, and silent reader. At every step, from politics to art, the ability to consume and process ideas in silence allowed for a complexity and depth of thought that was previously hard to achieve. One could say that we built the modern world in the silence of our libraries and studies. However, it's interesting to note how current technology is creating a new hybrid. We read silently, but we do so on social platforms where comments and debate are instantaneous. It's a kind of return to communal reading, but in a new digital and textual format. The thread culture on platforms like X, formerly Twitter, or discussions in forums like Reddit are forms of thinking out loud textually. An idea is shared and refined through public interaction, a digital echo of philosophical debates in the Agora of Athens. So, are we losing the superpower of deep silent reading in this new environment? Some neuroscientists warn that screen reading, characterized by distraction and rapid scanning, could be weakening the brain circuits for sustained concentration that book reading helped build. The ability to immerse oneself in a complex text for hours in a state of uninterrupted flow is a type of meditation. It's a training for the mind that fosters patience, attention to detail, and the ability to follow a long argument. It's a refuge from the noise of the digital world. Preserving this space of silence and concentration is perhaps one of the greatest intellectual challenges of our time. It's about protecting that room of one's own in our mind that silent reading helped us furnish over the centuries. It's a legacy worth actively defending. Ultimately, the history of reading shows us that there isn't one single right way to interact with text. Each method, whether oral and communal or silent and individual, offers unique gifts and challenges. Each molds our minds in different and profound ways. The emergence of medieval copyists was a key intermediate step. When transcribing texts, they often murmured the words to themselves, a process known as ruminatio. They chewed on the words to digest their meaning, a bridge between oral and fully silent reading. The separation of writing and reading was also crucial. In the ancient world, often the same person who wrote the text was the one who read it aloud. Over time, these became distinct skills, allowing the reader to focus solely on decoding and comprehension. The Library of Alexandria, though an immense center of knowledge, would have been a noisy place. Imagine hundreds of scholars reading their scrolls aloud or in a constant murmur. The silence we associate with a library today is, historically, a very recent invention. Silent reading also changed architecture. Libraries began to be designed with spaces for individual study, like carrels or cubicles in monasteries and universities. The physical space adapted to protect and foster the new habit of private thought. This cognitive shift even affected writing. Authors began to write for a silent reader, not for a listener. They could use more complex sentence structures, longer arguments, and subtle references, trusting that the reader could stop and reread to grasp the full meaning. The privacy of silent reading was especially important for women in eras when their education and intellectual expression were restricted. Through books, they could explore ideas and worlds beyond their domestic sphere, in a safe and invisible space to others. Literary criticism as a formal discipline is almost unthinkable without silent reading. It requires the ability to analyze a text closely, to go back and forth, to compare passages, and to take notes. All of this is a slow, methodical, and above all, silent process. Silent reading allows us to control the pace of our information intake. We can speed up through parts we understand and linger on those that challenge us. It's a fully personalized learning experience, adapted in real time by our own brains. The emotional relationship we develop with fictional characters is more intense in silent reading. Without an oral mediator, the characters' voices speak directly into our heads, creating a more intimate and powerful connection. We feel them as our own thoughts. The development of genres like the diary or autobiography is also linked to this change. The practice of reading about the inner lives of others fostered an interest in examining and recording one's own. Introspection became a worthy subject to be written and read about. Thus, the reader ceased to be a mere passive receiver in an audience. They became an active participant, a co-creator of meaning. Each person who reads Don Quixote silently creates a slightly different version of the story in their mind, a unique and unrepeatable experience. Oral reading hasn't disappeared, of course. It lives on in recited poetry, in plays, in the stories we read to children before bed. In these contexts, we value the beauty of language's sound and the human connection created by sharing a story aloud. Even the way law and contracts evolved was influenced by this change. Silent reading and standardized punctuation allowed for the creation of complex and unambiguous legal documents, which could be precisely studied and referenced. The transition can also be seen in art. Medieval paintings often depicted books as objects of veneration, held by saints or angels. In the Renaissance and beyond, we increasingly see ordinary people portrayed in the intimate act of reading. This superpower gave us a new kind of freedom, the freedom to explore any idea, no matter how strange or dangerous, in the safety of our own mind. It's a freedom we often take for granted, but one that was won through a long and silent revolution. The act of reading silently creates a bubble of concentration around us. It isolates us from the chaos and distractions of the outside world, allowing us to enter a state of deep focus. It's a survival skill in the noisy 21st century. Interestingly, when we learn to read as children, we start like the ancients. We read aloud, word by word, to connect symbols with sounds. Silent reading is the second step, a level of mastery achieved when the process becomes automated in our brain. The next time you see someone engrossed in a book in a park or on public transport, you're not just seeing a person reading. You're seeing someone perform an act of cognitive magic, a feat that would have left an ancient Roman scholar speechless. You're witnessing a superpower in action. History teaches us that the tools that shape our intellect are often invisible. Silent reading is perhaps the most important of all. It's the software running in the background of our minds, enabling complex thought, imagination, and introspection. The reader's journey has been long and fascinating. From the public square to the private room, from ear to eye, from sound to silence. An evolution that not only changed our relationship with books, but fundamentally altered the fabric of our consciousness. We can see then that something as simple as reading silently is actually a cultural and cognitive achievement of gigantic proportions. It's a skill that required technological, social, and neural changes, and which, in turn, unleashed new ways of thinking, feeling, and organizing ourselves as a society. From the orators of antiquity who gave voice to texts, to the monk who ruminated on them in his cell, and the scholar who devoured them in silence, each stage has left us a legacy. Today, we are heirs to all these forms of reading, capable of choosing the one that best suits our needs. Reading in antiquity was an echo, a resonance that filled space. Today, for us, reading is a silence, but a silence full of voices, ideas, and worlds. A silence that is paradoxically one of the richest and most populated spaces we can inhabit. So the next time you lose yourself in the pages of a book, remember the journey. Remember that you are participating in a millennia-old tradition that has been sculpted by scribes, saints, inventors, and millions of anonymous readers who, like you, sought a deeper connection in silence. This ability to create a private cinema in our minds with characters, settings, and emotions is the ultimate gift of silent reading. It's proof that the most powerful technology is still the one we carry inside our skulls, activated by the simple act of turning a page. Every book read in silence is an affirmation of our individuality and our capacity for deep thought. It is an act of resistance against distraction, a commitment to concentration, and a celebration of the infinite complexity of the human mind. So the next time you pick up a book, remember you're not just choosing a story. You're choosing to activate an ancient superpower that allows you to travel through time, inhabit other minds, and ultimately better understand yourself and the world around you. In conclusion, the shift from oral to silent reading was not a simple change of habit. It was one of the most profound transformations in human history, one that reconfigured our minds and laid the groundwork for the modern world of individual thought and innovation. Thank you so much for joining me on this fascinating journey through the history of reading. I hope it has given you a new appreciation for that silent and powerful act you perform every day. It's been a true pleasure to share these insights with you. If you enjoyed this video and want to discover more hidden secrets in the history of literature and thought, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And now I'd love to hear your thoughts. What surprised you most about this story? Let me know in the comments below.